Mercy for Animals is an organization that's really special to me. It's really close to my heart. And we have the president here today, which is a huge honor for our festival. Leah Garcés is the president of Mercy for Animals, and she has been fighting for better food and farming systems for her whole career. What a career. And she has nearly 20 years of leadership experience in the animal protection movement. She's legit, y'all. She oversaw international campaigns in 14 countries at the World Society for the Protection of Animals, then launched Compassion in World Farming in the U.S. after having done that. Leah is also on the advisory boards of Encompass and Seattle Food Tech. Is that where you're based, Seattle?
Guess where I'm based.
Where are you based?
Where am I based? Right here.
You're kidding.
I am.
How long?
Brilliant. 10 years.
My goodness. My goodness. Well, this is an extra special pleasure.
You didn't see me, but I was an OG at Veg Fest. So.
You were?
Right here, yeah.
From the beginning?
From the beginning.
Amazing.
First one, yeah.
This is thrilling. In that tiny little space?
Uh-huh.
Wow. Oh, my goodness.
It's exciting.
Y'all remember, we've grown. We love your support. Thank you so much. She lives here. She lives here with her husband, her 3 kids, and her 2 cats.
Who couldn't come here because they're obsessed with marshmallows. So they went straight to the marshmallow table.
Fair. Y'all, let's give a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that wonderful intro. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you all for choosing to be at this talk instead of free marshmallows, which is where my 3 kids are right now. I really appreciate it. Okay, so how many people know who Mercy for Animals is? Woo! All right, that's pretty good. Okay, all right. Well, if you don't, I think I have a clicker here. Here we go. I'm going to tell you a little bit about us first before I tell you a story. Okay, so, is that working? Oh, I have to do the tricks. Okay, so I started Mercy for Animals for a little over a year ago, but Mercy for Animals is celebrating its 20-year anniversary this year, which is super exciting. Woo, right? So we were started by a 15-year-old in Ohio, and who was really unhappy with what he was seeing around him. And he started doing things like going into battery cage farms, hen farms, and filming them, and literally was pulling the video footage on a wagon behind him back in the day, pre-internet kind of days, and started to get the word out. And we grew, and we grew, and we grew, and now we're an organization in 6 different countries and 120 staff. And this is our mission, our vision. Who does this vision resonate with anyone in the room? Yeah. Yeah. Our vision is a world where animals are respected, protected, and free to pursue their own interests. That's the world I want to live in. That's what gets me out of bed every day. Now, how are we going to do that? So Mercy for Animals specifically focuses on constructing a compassionate world, a compassionate food system. And that word is very specific. So quite often as animal advocates, as animal rights advocates, we're seen as people who are just coming to tear down things, right? Tear down a way of life, someone's right to eat something, someone's livelihood, and we're really trying to put another message, another narrative out there. We're not just here to end something that's bad, but we're here to construct something that's amazing, that everyone will benefit from. Because the system we have now is based on violence and oppression, and we can all benefit from a world that's based on compassion. And so we are about constructing that compassionate world. And there's 2 paths we're doing that. One is by reducing the suffering of animals that are trapped in factory farming today. And there are 80 billion of them. And for the foreseeable future, for the short term, that's going to continue. And so we can't ignore that. And so Mercy for Animals works on slowly reducing the suffering of animals in that. And so those are things like getting rid of cages and crates. And we do that because we believe in reducing the suffering of the animals that are trapped in that system. But we have an end game in mind. And our end game is ending the exploitation of animals for food altogether. So we keep both of those in the balance. Still got everybody?
Yes.
All right. Still with me?
Yes.
Good. My kids still aren't here, but that's all right.
Marshmallows are good.
I know, I can't compete with dandies. No one can. All right, so I want to start I'm going to talk about my book and my journey as an advocate and the work I've been doing and the work Mercy for Animals will continue doing. Whoops, I went one far ahead. Okay, so I'm from Georgia. I've been living here 10 years now. And in the summer of 2014, I found myself sitting across from a man who, by every definition, was my enemy. My life, as you know, is devoted to protecting farmed animals and ending factory farming. And up until this point, my entire career was devoted to fighting against everything this man stood for. And now I was in his living room. And as I sat there, the questions were really swirling in my head. You see, I'm sure many of you know this, but it's really hard to get footage from inside a chicken factory farm. And I had been trying for years to get footage like this so I could show the public what was going on inside a chicken factory farm. But every attempt had failed on my part. As I sat there, I kept thinking, why in the world had this man invited me into his house? And more importantly, why had I gone? And that day, I had driven from my home in Decatur, not far from here, to his home in Fairmont, North Carolina, which is the poorest county in rural North Carolina. And as I drove there, I was convinced it was an ambush. I had told my husband, who's now sitting in the back with my 3 kids, they were able to tear themselves away from the marshmallows. Great. I told my husband, look, here's the address. If I don't come back, look for me rotting away in the chicken litter. That's probably where I'll be. And my life did change that day forever. So that day, I met Craig Watts. He had been raising chickens for Purdue for 22 years, and Purdue is the 4th largest chicken company in the country. You see, when he was a young man, he had really searched for this way to stay on the land that had been passed down 5 generations in his family, in one of the poorest counties in rural North Carolina, where there were almost no job options. So tobacco had fallen out, and there was nothing else going on for him. So when the chicken industry came to town, he thought, wow, dream come true. So he took a $250,000 loan out at 22 and used that money to build chicken houses. And so Purdue brought chickens to him, and he used those houses, he raised chickens, and then Purdue would pay him after each flock. And he would use that money then to pay off the loan like a mortgage. And at first it went fine, but of course, it's a chicken factory farm. And pretty soon, the chickens started to get sick. After all, these are chickens, 25,000 of them stuffed wall to wall in a windowless warehouse with feces on the floor that they're living on, toxic ammonia air that they're breathing. And when chickens get sick, some of them died. And you don't get paid for dead chickens. And he started to fall behind on his payments. He started to struggle to pay off his loan. And pretty soon, he realized he had made a mistake. He realized he had made a big mistake. But he had no way out at this stage. And he was basically an indentured servant. So when I met him, he had reached this breaking point where the payments seemed never-ending, and so did the illness and death and despair of those chickens. Now, if we humans tried to come up with a system for food production that was really dirty and really cruel and really unhealthy and unfair and unjust, we literally, I don't think, could have come up with anything as horrible as factory farming. There are 80 billion chickens, pigs, cows that are killed and slaughtered and raised around the world every single year. And they're stuffed in warehouses and cages, and they never see the light of day. But that's not just a problem for the animals, right? The world's factory farmed animals and the industry produce more greenhouse gas emissions than the world's planes, trains, and automobiles put together. And 1/3 of our arable land is used to raise feed for feeding these animals in these cruel circumstances instead of humans. And ecologically important habitat is sprayed with immeasurable chemicals and cut down. Rainforests are cut down like the burning Amazon right now. by the time my kids in the back grow up, there probably won't be any Sumatran elephants or polar bears. In my lifetime, I'm 41, the number of birds, amphibians, mammals, and reptiles has halved. And the main culprit is our global appetite for meat, eggs, and dairy. And for me, up until this point in my life, the main villain was Craig Watts. But it's really easy to hate someone that you've never met before. So Craig and I had been sitting there for a few hours at this stage, and midday had gone from afternoon to dusk to evening, and now it was totally dark. And he suddenly said to me, "Ready to see the chickens?" Why had he waited, I kept thinking, for darkness? And it occurred to me, he didn't want to raise suspicion around him with his service tech, with his neighbors. He was as nervous as I was. But we went anyway. And he brought me under the cover of darkness down a dirt road until we reached these long gray warehouses. And we walked towards one of them. And I'll never forget it. He swung open the wooden door. We stepped inside, and I felt assaulted by an overpowering smell, and every muscle in my body tensed up. My eyes teared. I coughed. I was so overwhelmed with my own physical discomfort, I didn't even look around at first. But when I did, it brought me to tears. All around me were newly hatched baby chicks who were living on their own feces, breathing toxic ammonia air, with nowhere to go and nothing to do. And I knew, without a doubt, those birds would grow at an unnaturally fast pace, driven by the genetics that they've been selected for. They would suffer, and they would end up on someone's plate. So I returned many times in the months after that day, and I walked those houses with Craig Watts. And I saw and learned and heard from him everything that there was to learn about chicken factory farming. And mostly what he did was walk those houses and pick up dead and dying chickens. Chickens that had messed up legs, had trouble breathing, could hardly walk. We captured all of that, all of those conversations, all of those horrors on film. And in the fall of 2014, we decided to do something I never expected to do. We decided to release that footage. Now, this was a huge risk for both of us. It was a risk for him because he risked losing everything. He risked losing his land, his income. He risked his neighbors hating him, his community hating him. Everyone around him raises chickens. So he was worried he was about to speak out against the income of his entire community. And I was working for Compassion in World Farming, and I was worried about getting them sued or being the cause of him losing everything. But we did it anyway. And the New York Times broke the story. And within 24 hours, 1 million people had seen our footage. It went viral. And the horrors of chicken factory farming were on a global map all of a sudden, a global platform. And it was because of this unlikely alliance between a vegan animal rights activist and a chicken factory farmer speaking out against this industry. And this really got me thinking, what other unlikely allies are out there as we fight for a more compassionate food system and world? So 2 years later, I started to really kind of think about this and collect lessons and think about these lessons. So I want to share some of these lessons. I have 3 main ones for you. And the first one that I will tell you is that we have to become comfortable as advocates being uncomfortable. Speaking to people who agree with us it's not going to get us to the solution. After all, the people who often hold the power to change the situation are not the people who are agreeing with us. So in my case, it was the chicken factory farmer and the meat industry. I'm not in charge of a single chicken. So if I want to change the industry, I have to somehow reach them. I have to enter their space. I have to figure out why are they resisting. I have to figure out what is their struggle. And I have to try to understand it if I'm going to get to a decent solution and make progress. And 2 years after releasing with Craig in the fall of 2016, I did something again I never expected to do. I sat down with a much bigger so-called enemy, Jim Perdue himself. The very man I had made the villain of my viral video. After many long conversations, many difficult, uncomfortable, messy conversations with them, they decided to put out the first animal care policy ever by a big poultry company, and to address some of the things we had criticized them for not doing, like putting windows in the houses to let sunshine in and not making the farmers pay for them. And sure, they have a lot further to go. And we keep having those conversations, and because of those conversations, because I'm willing to sit down, we keep making progress. The second lesson that I learned is that we have to see the so-called enemy that we're sitting down with as a human being that probably has a lot more in common with us than we care to admit. We're so engulfed in our principles sometimes that we don't want to have a conversation. We just want to be right, and we want the other person to be agreeing with us for the reasons we're agreeing. So I'm going to give you an example. I went to visit the headquarters of a chicken company not far from here, and it was the first time they had ever invited an animal rights advocate group to come and speak to them. And as we walked in, we checked in, we did our name badges, and we're walking, my coworker, Rachel Druskin, and I are walking down the hallway, and literally we see people coming out of their cubicles like this, like what do animal rights activists look like? And I just look like this, so not scary. And we get into the main room, and the main executive in charge of the chickens, who's the main vet there, has his arms crossed, and he's got his head like this, and he's looking at me like, I do not want to be here. And I'm super nervous, and I'm pulling up my laptop, and up comes my background photo on my laptop. And it's my 3 kids, right? And who are waving at you now, yes. Yes. And as I'm doing that, I see him uncross his arms and look at me and lean forward. And clearly my daughter looks different than the boys in the back over there. And he says, "Are those your kids?" And I say, "Yeah, those are my kids. I'd just been back 1 month from adopting my daughter." And I start babbling on about it, about all the highs and lows, and I was super emotional. I was just back at work, and it was really challenging, and I was way too chatty for a professional talk. And in those moments, though, he changed his body language, and he says to me, "I have 2 adopted kids from China." And it turns out his family, his wife and him, run a ministry for foster care. And we used to start talking about the highs and lows of that and raising kids and for 20 minutes. And we totally forgot who we were supposed to be at this table. And in those moments, the wall came down and a bridge was built, and we crossed this divide as 2 human beings who were able to connect. And because of that, we were able to trust each other and have a conversation. He was able to listen, and I was able to listen, and we were able to make some really concrete progress on how they're treating their chickens to reduce the suffering of those animals. The last lesson that I have for you is we have to look for the win-win. So instead of thinking about when I go to see somebody like Craig, or instead of thinking about Craig Watts. Now, I used to literally wish people like him ill. I used to blame him and be angry with him. And I had to flip that mentality and think, instead of thinking, how can I put him out of a job? How can I put him out of his work and putting food on the table for his family? I started to think, how can I shift him into a different way of farming, like mushrooms or hemp or something else? And a farmer I later worked with named Mike Weaver did exactly that. So he did the same thing with me. We filmed inside of his houses and exposed the horrific cruelty under Pilgrim's Pride. And he ended up quitting chicken factory farming. And it turns out that those warehouses used to raise chickens are really good for something else. That's hemp, by the way. So it turns out this is an environmentally friendly way to stay on the land, make money. It's a win-win. One that a vegan animal rights activist and an ex-chicken factory farmer can get really behind. And instead of thinking about, for these meat companies, I know, right? It's so cool. This is in West Virginia. And in fact, Mercy for Animals is coming out with a video on him on Monday, so check it out. And a new project called Transformation. Get it? You like that? Yes. Which is all about helping farmers transition out of factory farming and into other means plant-based products. And so instead of thinking with the meat industry, I used to go in and think, I'm going to put them out of business. I'm going to make them bankrupt. So I switched my thinking, and I thought, how can we help them evolve into a different kind of business? What do these businesses care about? They care about the bottom line, their shareholders, their brand, their customers, their employees. So how can I still meet that concern with a different business model? And you might think that's crazy, but you would be surprised because big meat companies are starting to shift in that direction. And you have companies like Tyson and Purdue and Cargill saying that they are going to explore plant-based alternatives. We all know Burger King has an Impossible Burger. I never thought it's Impossible Whopper. And this is an incredible evolution of a business that we should support. This is a win-win, where we're getting them to evolve into a different kind of business. At Purdue, Jim Purdue himself said to Bloomberg in an article, you can Google this later, he said, our company, our job is to produce premium protein, and nothing in that says it has to come from animals. It was like, what? A chicken company is saying that protein doesn't have to come from animals? This is their model. This gives me a lot of hope. And if y'all live in Atlanta, you know about this. Right? KFC started testing plant-based chicken nuggets, and I was there. And I showed up at 10 o'clock in the morning when it opened. And you would think that they were giving out Beyonce tickets for free because there were lines wrapped all around the building. There was traffic stopped all directions. They painted the building green. The world is ready for this shift. So as advocates, we have to think about building the biggest tent possible that everyone, from the vegan animal rights activist to the factory farmer to the meat industry, can all get behind. We won't win over the world. We won't bring about a compassionate food system that we want by beating down our enemies, but instead by finding that win-win and forging a path together. And believe me, I know that's easier said than done. It takes a lot of courage, and it's difficult, and it's messy, and it's uncomfortable to do that kind of work. But it's critical. It requires us, instead of thinking about us versus them, it's about all of us against an unjust system of violence and oppression. It's critical if we want to create that compassionate food system and world that we all, from the chicken to the factory farmer to all of us, deserve. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. So, little housekeeping note, we're going to have time for some question and answer. I will moderate that. I will keep a watch on our time. I'll let you know how many questions we have time for. We're also going to have a book signing after. So if I shut down Q&A a little early, that's why. It's just to go get ready for that. That's going to be just outside of this room. The next talk in this room, who has a program handy? Is that going to be at 12:30, I think, an hour from now? Yes. Somebody can confirm that? Awesome. Yep. So I'm going to be in this room all day, y'all, and that's by choice. The talks in here are going to be incredible all day. So if you're planning on spending the day with us, come in, sit a spell, enjoy an inspiring talk. Every talk is different, about a different way to help you learn and grow, and give you more tools for your toolkit to go out into the world and have these hard conversations with people or feel affirmed in your choice. So yeah, definitely come spend more time with us. So for Q&A, a little bit of guidance. Let's please focus on asking questions instead of making comments. If there is something that you want to talk about with Lee or one of the organizers, we're happy to do that outside of this room or after the presentation. But for now, it would really be best if we could have the questions in the form of a question. And I will hand it over to the audience now to answer some questions.
Great.
All right, I saw the hand over here first. Oh, the other thing, typically we will have in this room people queuing up at the mic, but because this is a pretty reasonable room for me, I'm going to walk around to folks. If you have any mobility and you can't get to the mic stand at later presentations, just let me know and I'll help you out. All right, who was it here?
Okay, so form of a question. How awesome are you? There's that one. The next question.
Great question. That's my favorite question I've ever had. Thank you.
When you're dealing with working with the farmers, you mentioned going in darkness for the neighbors and the secrecy. Do you work with them to later help explain to their neighbors and their community what's going on to bring that out, or is that still more in the
we
future?
do not, and that's a really good suggestion. I really feel it's important that we think of the wider community, and I've only just started to kind of break down what that would look like. And as I said, as animal rights advocates, we're often seen as the nemesis, as the evildoers in these communities. And I think it's critical we change that narrative if we want to end factory farming. We have to be seen as we're trying to create a compassionate world for everyone, including those communities, which means we have to think about what they need, like jobs, which means we have to bring, cannabis to everywhere, basically.
Awesome. Another one right here. No, you just hold it to your mouth. You don't have to press anything.
What led to this change in your approach to activism? Was it because Mr. Watts reached out to you? Is that where it started, or did you speak to other activists or come to it on your own? Thank you.
That's a great question. So, as I said, I had been trying to get footage from inside one of these farms through not an undercover means. So I had been contacting the companies, I had been contacting farmers, been trying. And it turned out there was a journalist named Brian Grow who actually lives in my neighborhood who writes for Reuters, and he contacted me about an article he was writing on antibiotics in the chicken industry. And he asked me to come to Kavarna in Oakhurst, if anybody knows that place, and said, can you come look at these papers? I can't make sense of them. And he had a stack of papers like this big of the listing of the feed the chickens were being given, which is highly secretive information, commercially secretive. And I was like, where did you get this? Where is this information from? And I figured he was going to say, I snuck it out, I have an undercover investigator in a place. And he was like, oh, this farmer, Craig Watts, gave it all to me. He's really unhappy. And I was like, can you put me in touch with him? I will be the first to admit that I went there not with the intention of building a friendship. I went there with the ends and meat. I needed footage. I'm going to do what it takes. I'm going to pretend to be whoever I need to pretend to be to go get that footage. But when I sat there in his living room and I sat there and I listened to his struggle and his strife and what he had been to, the choices he had made, that's when I started to shift. And there was a friend of mine where I was trying to process, like, what is happening to me? It was really hard for me to accept that this was a human being that I cared about, that I was starting to care about. It was really hard. And I talked to a lot of people about it. One of them was a friend of mine named Dave Soleil, who is a scholar on nonviolence. And he's like, you're falling into the path of nonviolence, which is the philosophy of Martin Luther King, Gandhi. And I started to dive really deep into some of the thinking and the main kind of message, and I'm very fresh with this because I just did a workshop yesterday at MLK Center, which is hate the oppression, not the oppressor. So hate the system, but not the people. And in order to make progress, we have to create what Martin Luther King calls a beloved community, which is everybody. And if you think about factory farming and its impact, for all of us in this room, probably the first thing in our minds is the animals, but it hurts everybody. It really does. Ultimately, it hurts everybody. When you think about climate change, you think about pollution, communities, our health, it hurts everybody. And we need to, so it was like it changed my life, meeting him. I did not mean for it to. I did not go in intentionally. I fell into this pathway, and I feel very lucky for that.
Cool. We've got about 10 more minutes, so we have time for more questions. I have one right here.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the great talk. You said something about looking for other opportunities to connect with allies, and I just kind of wonder if you'd made any inroads with any of the industrial hog farms, CAFOs, that kind of thing in the Midwest or anywhere.
Yeah, so I've been focused on chicken factory farming because it's 90% of all animals are chickens. So in terms of impact, that's where I've been focused. But we have started to look at dairy, where I feel there is a kind of possibility there. Dairy is one of the most cruel, it's horrible, right? It's the worst. In terms of cruelty, it is taking a mother and a baby and separating them, and that being the systematic way things happen. It's horrible. But also, the milk prices are dropping, and farmers have lost a lot of their income. And in Wisconsin right now, suicide rates for farmers are at the highest rate they've ever been at in history. Dairy farmers, right? And a lot of you might go like, so what? But I'm trying, the empathy does not mean endorsement. Let me be clear. But there is an opportunity in that, and some of those Wisconsin farmers are starting to explore hemp as well, and Vermont as well. So one of the ideas I have is to look at dairy farmers transitioning to hemp farming as a possibility, or other types like oat farming, things like this, where we could do a swap. So I think there are other options out there for sure, but the hog industry, no. I would say cattle and hog industry are super difficult, and I haven't got there yet. We haven't got there, but chicken is where we're starting because it has the highest impact.
Yeah, there was an audible gasp and sign of sadness in the back of the room when you shared that about those suicides. I think the people in this room really care a lot, and it's really special to be among all of you. All right, we have a question right here.
Apparently, a lot of these folks seem to be disconnected with the pain and suffering of the animals, at least at the time.
Yeah.
After you've met them and discussed things with them and said with them, how is it that they're able to come from that disconnect to somewhat empathy, or how?
Yeah, all of the farmers I've worked with have stopped factory farming. They go through a journey where they abandon it because it's unjust to them, it's unjust to the animals. I really watch these farmers, and they have to do this decision between money in their pocket and hurting these animals. And it's a very feeding their family or hurting these, and they're constantly doing it with this really, and I have in my book, I really question, what does this do to a person's soul? What does it do to your spirit to have this as your job? I think there's a lot of psychological trauma with these farmers, where they're torn between their economic hardship and lack of opportunity And as I said, like Craig chose this because he wanted to stay on the land and he didn't have any other options. Again, empathy doesn't mean endorsement. I don't endorse what they do. What they're doing is cruel. But I empathize with their situation. And it's through that empathy, I think we have to try to find ways to help them out of that situation.
Awesome. We have got another one here in the back.
With what you just said, I totally agree with that. I grew up on a farm, and I remember when my dad had to butcher our pigs. I mean, it just tore his nerves up to have to make that decision. And it is about feeding your family versus what we were educated in believing with animals, not being sentient beings. But my question is, I watched the video with the farmer that you showed. What is he doing now, and was he able to keep his land? Because that's so awful that losing your family farm must have been devastating for him too.
Yeah, he's a farmer advocate now. He works for SRAP, and he goes into communities telling them not to sign up to factory farming. So he's an activist now.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Got one
and
right
he
here.
still has his land, and his wife's a teacher. Yeah.
Hi, a big driver obviously is demand. So when talking about trying to reduce the demand for meat, how do you talk to people who just kind of turn a blind eye, don't want to hear about all the horribleness and just want to keep eating their meat? Are there like some talking points that you would recommend?
And I had a similar question. I've been a vegan animal activist for over 20 years, and recently one of the challenges I've had on social media is everybody talking about this Popeye's chicken sandwich. And I don't want to be rude to people, but I want to speak my truth as well. And so kind of going with her question, how do you, especially when there's like almost this like frenzy, like people are freaking out, how do you speak truth to that in a way that's still respectful and still draws them in without being alienating?
Yeah, that's a very difficult line to walk. And so as an activist, I went through like 3 phases where first I thought, well, it's just because people don't know. If I just tell them, they'll know. So I spent a good number of years just like trying to tell people. And then I realized they did know and they didn't care. And that made me super angry. And then I became angry activist where, you know that person. Right, there may be some in the room. Hi, you're waving in the back. Hi, yeah. Right, and then I let go of that anger, and I thought that the important part is the end that we're trying to reach. So I had been so obsessed with getting people to caring about chickens and thinking they're special, but that there's a lot of ways you can get to not eating meat. And finding the thing that speaks to different people is the entry point. So, for example, my dad had a heart attack a year ago, and he had a heart attack because he eats too much meat. And it was through the health component that both of my parents have now gone mostly plant-based. And now, once they entered that space and they didn't feel judged, now they're listening a little bit better to the cruelty. But before that, walls came up, like, I'm not cruel, don't judge me. So you have to go in, I think, if you're seeing people on Popeyes, you could maybe say, oh, there's this really cool, healthy other option. Did you see that KFC is doing like a nugget that's this, and that's gonna be cool, and that, and that doesn't have cholesterol, and also, probably no chicken feces in it either from the slaughterhouse, yuck, You can think about what would appeal to the audience, not like, why do you care about it? But try to walk in the shoes of the other person, I guess.
Sure, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi, I follow several organizations such as PETA, Humane Society, and your organization, which is amazing. I'm wondering, do you collaborate with the other organizations, or is there an umbrella group that facilitates in that type of collaboration, maybe to provide some political influence? I know the health angle is probably the best angle to approach this, but I'm just wondering, the group as a whole, I think, could be more influential, and I'm just wondering how you participate in that.
Yeah, so we work in many different coalition settings. I'm a big believer in coalition work. So, for example, we have a big campaign called the Better Chicken Initiative, and it is with the Humane League, Compassion in World Farming, Compassion Over Killing, Mercy for Animals, World Animal Protection. There's a bunch of us that are all working for the same progress. And the same in the legislative front. We have a coalition on legislation, same groups, but also ALDF and ASPCA. So I really believe in coalition efforts. However, I will say, in terms of like, should there be an overarching organization, the kind of saying is that it's better to have 20 knocks at the door than one. So if a politician is getting 20 knocks, it's like recorded as 20 knocks and 20 annoying people who are trying to get a change. If we all come as one voice, then it's just one voice. And so I think there's power in having a lot of groups working together rather than one group that's representing everybody.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so everyone, we have time for one more question, so I'm going to hand the mic to that person. But I always like to ask this, if people want to keep the conversation going with you, are you going to be around today? How should they stay in touch? Obviously, we'll have the book signing.
I'll be at the Cinnaholic table all day. I'm honest.
Planted
Or
there.
Mercy for Animals table, too. I'll be around, yes. And also, I live here, so, we can... my email's not up there, but it's leahg@mercyforanimals.org. So
cool.
It's very easy, or you can write me on any one of those social media platforms too.
So
I live here.
this is absolutely not your last chance to engage. Keep the conversation going through any of those avenues. All right, final question.
Thank you. I'll finish with the same question it started with. How awesome are you? No, my real question. So I'm just curious how if you sort of compartmentalize your life between professional and personal, and I'll elaborate on what I mean a little bit of like, are all your friends vegan? Do you talk about this? Do you sort of have boundaries? Because I find that it can sometimes be alienating on like the things that mean a lot to me that I want to talk about versus some of my relationships with my closest friends. It's like I can't talk about that stuff and they don't want to hear it. And similar to what you were talking about with your parents. I'm just curious sort of what that looks like for you in your life.
A lot of my friends are not vegan. They're not even vegetarian. But I actually feel like it's really healthy to have to be outside of that circle. Not only are you bringing a perspective to them that they will not hear otherwise, they're bringing a perspective to you. We can get in our bubble, in our vegan animal rights bubble, and think like things are either better or worse than they are, or that we're making more progress than we are. And like going out with my girlfriends for dinner and having them all order like octopus is a reminder that we're not indicator, I do compartmentalize it. My whole family's vegan, so in my house I feel good. And it's hard though. I recognize how difficult it is, but like I said, this way, what we do requires courage. It requires diplomacy and being okay with progress and reducing suffering rather than being the end of it. I think it's not an easy path we've all chosen, for sure, but it's a really important one.
That was beautiful. Thank y'all for your thoughtful questions.
Thank you to my brilliant MC.
Thank you.